All right. Well, you're listening to the Weekly Wellness Check here on The Source 91.3 WVST. I'm Jennifer Williamson, along with Dr. Alton Hart Jr., Director of the Crater Health District. And it's time to bring in our guest. June, it's Men's Health Month, so you've been hearing a lot about that and been hearing a lot about it, especially on this show, as we've geared a lot of our June guests toward that. And today, we have Dr. Frederick C. Sanders. Dr. Sanders, a.k.a. Freddie. If we call him Freddie today, you'll know why. He is what is called a creatorpreneur. He's also an award-winning performance coach, speaker, and author. He has served numerous organizations, including Lyra Health, Better Up, Coach Hub, Landit, and the pro athlete community. And he completed his PhD in professional coaching and human development from the International University of Professional Studies. He proudly holds the prestigious ICF credential of Mastered Certified Coach. And he's also the founder of Winning OS, the ultra learning community and operating system, equipping creators, coaches, and career changers to leverage the creator economy to generate unmitigated, uninterrupted freedom. And Freddie passionately champions the empowerment and advancement of BIPOC voices, creators, and leaders globally. And he envisions a world where the highest sense of integrity, agency, and freedom fully emerges among all humanity. So, Dr. Sanders, Dr. Frederick Sanders, Freddie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Thank you for being here. People heard us earlier say something, Dr. Freddie. So before we dive into today's topic, let's tear apart this phrase, so to speak, that I mentioned earlier, performative masculinity. What is that? Can you explain?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, too often we hear this term being thrown around called toxic masculinity, right?
Yes.
And which immediately assigns this negative connotation to masculinity and makes it wrong, right? And I found it, especially in my work, I found it more accurate to call it performative masculinity because that's exactly what it is.
I like
it's
that
a
better.
Performance. Yeah. It's a performance. So performative masculinity is this idea that being a man means acting out some script, typically written by society, or societal constructs. So it's like being on stage all the time, trying to prove you're man enough based on this very narrow, skewed definition of maleness. You got to be tough. You can't cry. You got to be in control all the time. You have to show no weakness or the perception of weakness, right? So performative masculinity is often rooted in the rejection of anything perceived as feminine, with the underlying, being the binary perception that femininity is weakness and masculinity is strongness or strength.
Right.
So especially for Black boys and men, it often means wearing this what's called the cool pose. It's this survival mechanism to protect ourselves from judgment, from danger, or even shame. But underneath that mask, there's often pain and anxiety and anger and confusion and really a deep hunger to be seen, fully seen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not about what we do. It's about what we feel we can't do, say, or feel as men. And that often begins in childhood.
Yeah. Wow. I wish we could talk about this in every sense and not just in the health sense, but because that's a deep topic we can talk about every day forever. But let's focus a little on the health aspect first. So in what ways does everything you just said, this performative masculinity, contribute to risky health behaviors among men, such as don't want to go to the doctor, or I've got a symptom and I'm going to ignore it. I'm just going to, soldier through it or what have you. And and I guess, so how does it affect it? And then are there differences in the way this affects health behaviors across different groups or communities?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So a lot of men, especially Black men, avoid going to the doctor because of this narrative that vulnerability feels like weakness. You know, like we're conditioned to just push through or man up, you know, and then by the time we do seek help, the issue's gotten worse,
Right.
you know, and in different communities based on, you know, the region you're from or income level or even religion, you'll see different expressions of this performance. You know, some are more rooted in being the provider, others in, you know, being physically dominant. But the underlying theme is the same. Don't look soft. Don't look weak. You know, and there's even this fear sometimes that shows up of seeming less than, even in front of health professionals. You know, because you know, if again, it's that narrative of if I'm vulnerable, then I'm weak and I'm less than and I'm not enough. So it all really goes back to this sense of worthiness and dignity.
Wow. Yeah, there's this series I watch. It's where they have it's couples therapy, and when the couples go in,
I love that show.
I
Yeah.
love that show. Yes, I do notice that the men do that. It's like, no, you're here to get help, and they're still putting the mask on. And yeah, I noticed that a lot. Like you said, they're there to get help, and they still have to put on a mask for the therapist. So, and the therapist is spending all their time just trying to get the mask off.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, since we're talking, you said this all stems back, again, this sounds like a big mental health issue almost. So what are some specific mental health challenges faced by African American males that may be worsened by these cultural expectations around masculinity?
Yeah. I mean, you name it. Depression, anxiety, burnout, overwhelm, low self-esteem, PTSD, greens, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, you name it. Like, you know, not to make light of it, but it's all of those things. And a big one is emotional suppression, repression, and oppression. You know, from a young age. Yeah, from a young age.
Say that again. Say that again. The emotional what? Say it again.
Emotional suppression.
Suppression, pushing it down.
Repression.
What's that part?
Repression is like, you know, repeatedly, like it keeps coming up and we keep pushing it down.
Okay.
And oppression, you know, I'm not even going to dignify it. I don't even want to see it. You know? And so from a young age, Black boys are told, you know, how often have we heard, stop crying before I give you something to cry about?
We've all heard that one.
You know,
but I can imagine
right,
it's worse for boys because, girls, I was a crybaby, so I was going to do it anyway.
Okay.
But even with that statement, you know, the inference.
A crybaby, yeah.
Yeah.
That crying, that there's something wrong with crying.
That there's something wrong with crying and that there wasn't something initially to cry about. So I need to give you something to cry about. So it's like they're totally invalidating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So that teaches us as men that emotions are not safe.
Right.
So then we bottle the emotions up, which we can and more than likely will erupt later as anger or depression. And in our communities, you know, talking about therapy or mental health, that's still taboo in a lot of spaces.
Yeah. You know? And I was going to ask.
Shame.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, how did that stigma and shame about mental health within especially the Black community, how does that make it harder now for these men, these African American men, to seek support?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. It definitely makes it more difficult because, you know, we have to learn as men that our emotions have value. You know, I had a client once that in one of our sessions, he said, you know, he used an expletive, but he said emotions or feelings don't get stuff done, right? And I said, well, you know, that's partially accurate.
Right. I've heard that one before myself. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the underlier there is that emotions don't have value and that our feelings don't have value. And our feelings and our emotions are emotional life alerts. Like there are biological life alerts. It's our body's way of communicating with us. Hey, there's something happening. There's something going on. Something occurring. Pay attention.
You said emotions are our body's life alert.
Yeah, there are biological life alerts. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm writing that one down.
Yes.
And you said it means pay attention.
Yeah, it means pay attention. Pay it. You know, I heard, I think it was Iyanla Vanzant once used PAIN as an acronym. Pay attention inward now.
Wow. That's pretty deep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's go back to something that you mentioned earlier. You talked about childhood. So just curious to dig into that a little bit more in terms of how maybe societal, familial influences to perform, and how those expectations to perform and conform to traditional masculine ideologies impact how young African-American men express their vulnerability. So how does the family, how does that context where we can get these early influences on this expression of vulnerability and performative masculinity?
Well, we mirror the example we see modeled at home. You know, so if a boy is taught by an adult, or if he sees the example from an adult that expressing emotion is bad or is wrong or is feminine, too feminine or weak, then he then learns to numb himself. He then numbs himself out real quick. And then that gets celebrated as being masculine. You know, like his ability to numb himself and not, you know, be stoic, you know, and not show emotion, that's then celebrated as being masculine. And so add society to the mix, you know, media, school, church, and then suddenly he's surrounded by this messaging that all says the same thing. Real men don't cry. Real men suck it up. You know, so he never learns how to safely ask for help, even when he's hurting.
Right.
Wow.
And add to that, Dr. Hart and Dr. Freddie, we've talked about this. Women have to visit a doctor very early in life due to our menstrual cycles, and then we are going regularly. Men don't have that real reason that brings them to the doctor. So now you have men not going to the doctor young, perhaps. And I talk to a lot of young men here at Virginia State University and say, when's the last time you had a physical? And they always have to think.
Wow. Yeah.
And now add this thing. That's a recipe for, again, your husband, your you know, the 50-year-old, whatever, not seeking help for these issues.
So
Yeah.
I want to go in a little bit of a different direction. And I'll come back to Black boys, but I want to ask you about something else related to the performative masculinity, and whether that is, and you talked earlier about being on stage and how that is a performance context in the workspace. So when we talk about Black men in the workspace, I think about a topic I heard some years ago from a researcher. He talked about goals driving stress. And that is that effort that Black men are always pushing and pushing and pushing to succeed, and then the health implications of that. Does that line up with the performative masculinity as well?
Absolutely. You know, in the work that I do, I say this all the time. You know, we are not machines. We are not machines, but yet we live in a world and a society where we kind of celebrate our machine likeness. You know, it's like it's all about achieving. You know, it's like this endless grind, right? But you know, one of my things is, you know, if you grind yourself long enough, you're going to end up in a pile of dust.
Ooh. Yes.
Writing that one down.
Well, I've heard that people say I got to get my grind on or something like that.
They love to
Right,
say that. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Rise
the
and grind.
Right.
the rise and grind, the hustle culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like this hustle culture is running us into the ground, and for what?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
You know, and it just kind of goes back to the industrial age construct of employment that you know that conditions us to be machine-like. It's about productivity.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know.
Right. And climbing a ladder. And I once heard a pastor say, you got to be careful climbing those ladders, because you might climb the ladder and find out your ladder was up against the wrong building.
Oh. Wow.
And that's what I
Yeah.
think many people, like you said, you literally said, for what? Why are we doing this? I
Yeah.
don't think we know for what most of the time. And I think many people do get up that ladder and go, why did I do all that?
Yes. Yeah.
You know?
So I want to dig
Exactly.
into this a little bit more, Dr. Freddie. So in terms, you mentioned the industrial influence and what have you. So what are some of the deeper issues, roots that come with the performative masculinity, this goal striving, stress, and the mask and always being on stage? Are there some deeper rooted issues related to this?
Yes, and I think the deeper rooted issue, it always goes back to worthiness. Always, it always goes back to our sense of worthiness and our sense of enoughness. You know, and so we often collapse worthiness and deservedness.
Oh. Okay, break that
Right.
down.
So deservedness is based on what you do. Worthiness is based on who you are. So you when you do something, there is a consequence. So you deserve or you've earned some type of reward or some type of consequence for something you have done. That is deservedness. Worthiness is innate. You're born with it. It is your birthright. You don't have to do anything to be worthy. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to hustle for it. You know, like your worthiness is non-negotiable. You know, I think it was Brene Brown that once said, you know, don't walk through the world looking for evidence that you are unworthy or that you are not enough, because you will always find it.
Very
Wow.
true.
Wow. So how did we get here as Black men? How did we get here?
Well, that's
I know that's a loaded question.
It's a way loaded question.
yeah. I mean, we, if we really want to go there, I mean, we could trace it all the way back to slavery.
Yes.
You know, like we are still in a lot of ways mentally enslaved. You know, so I mean that I don't know.
Yeah,
I
no,
don't know how much deeper we want to get than that.
That's deep. And you're listening to the Weekly Wellness Check here on The Source 91.3 WVST. If you're coming into this conversation and saying, wow, this is deep, it is. We are talking about the connection between performative masculinity and men's health today, as June is Men's Health Month. And our guest today is Dr. Frederick C. Sanders, Dr. Freddie. And he's an award-winning performance coach, speaker, author, and he's a multi-hyphenate. He's got a lot. He's got a lot of hyphens there. Dr. Freddie, appreciate you being with us again today.
All right, Dr. Freddie, I'll get you off that ledge, okay? So just to vector a little bit. So just talk about Black boys again. What role does peer pressure? We know that there's a lot out there. What role does peer pressure play in reinforcing performative masculinity that might affect Black boys' willingness to actually address their mental, emotional, or physical concerns?
Yeah. Peer pressure is, especially as an adolescent, is everything. You know, like we talked about the cool pose. You know, like being cool as an adolescent is like the golden ticket. So if a Black boy, you know, doesn't act hard or brush off his feelings or, act thuggish, in some ways or whatever, he risks being labeled as soft or as corny or as white or as acting white. Right.
And it even gets into sexuality. As much as we like to think we're progressive, kids still hurt each other by calling each other gay.
Exactly. As if that's, as if that's a dig.
Right.
So there's this unspoken rule book that gets enforced by your social circle as a kid, and even positive activities like reading or going to museums or things like that can often gets clowned or ridiculed because that's called acting white. So peer enforcement or peer influence can sometimes be even stronger than parental guidance during adolescence.
Right. Yeah. And we're dealing with a generation that is more aware of their state of mental health, right? But yet, I can surmise, Dr. Freddie, that because of this performative masculinity, they're suppressing even that. Many of them are suppressing even that. These feelings of, like you said, they're not feeling like they're enough. We can go into suicide rates from there. Right. I'm just thinking of they're thinking of suicide and they're not telling anyone because they're afraid.
Yeah.
And they need help.
Yeah. Absolutely. I personal experience of mine, last year I experienced a pretty severe bout with depression and anxiety and burnout. And one of the things that, among, therapy and, seeing a psychiatrist and, doing my deep inner work, like one of the things that helped me pull myself out of that depressive state was talking about it.
Amen.
Like, the more, and it was interesting, the more I talked about it with people who are in my circle, in my support system, the common thing that I heard was, oh yeah, I know what you mean. I've been there. Like 90% of the people that I talked to about it said, I've been there, or I know what you're talking about. And it was an aha moment for me. I was like, why, if this is so common, why is this not talked about more?
Right. Yeah. I just saw something last night. It was a series, and the woman in the series had, she was bipolar, and she was hiding it from everyone. She was hiding it from work. She had absences from work that were unexplained and about to get fired. Her relationships weren't going well. And she finally got up the courage after she got fired from her job. The one person she was closest to at the job, hey, let's go for coffee. And she finally got it off her chest and let the person know. And the person kind of she almost gave her a look like, I knew it was something, and she was like, thank you for telling me. And, she let her know, I'm not going anywhere. And she kind of resolved after that to tell everybody. And it was that same thing you just explained. After she told everybody, she felt a lot lighter because this thing she thought she was keeping as this dirty little secret wasn't all that to everybody. So many people could either relate to it, or it finally just explained for them, I get it now. I get you now.
Yeah. Yeah. So we don't have to suffer in silence.
Right.
We really don't. Yeah.
So, Dr. Freddie, I'm just curious, based on what you just shared in terms of your experience, has it or how has it changed your approach to coaching and working with Black men? What has that had an influence in how you navigate?
Yeah. This full like transparency, being open, being open and vulnerable with my own story. If I can be an example, a demonstration, a mirror for another man, so that he can see, oh man, you're just like me. You're showing me what's possible. Like for me, that's huge. And I have had several clients share with me, it's like, oh man, thank you so much for sharing your story with me.
Yeah.
And just imagine if there wasn't, again, all of this, suppression, repression, and oppression. It's like I wasn't only depressed, I was oppressed. There were things, there were parts of my what I would call like my dark side or my dark energy that I was hiding because, of this underlying narrative that I carried, that
Sure.
I can only show people my light.
Right.
I can only show people the best parts of me because that's what people want to see. No, like I get to show my mess. as
Right.
well. I get to be messy, and that's one really, really profound distinction that just was revealed to me recently, because one of the most one of the biggest struggles that men have is intimacy.
Right.
And that's intimacy with themselves, that's intimacy with other men, and one of the things that I've learned about intimacy is not only is it into me see, it's also into messy.
Wow.
So when we allow ourselves to get into the mess and be messy with each other, then like it's the mess that creates the connection with other people.
Yeah. I just want to say, you mentioned, I believe, burnout, and I didn't mention this to you before, but when we had the conversation some weeks ago, Dr. Freddie, about the broadcast, and at the top of the conversation, normally when we would talk, I would ask you how you're doing, and everything was wonderful. But this conversation was very different. We started at the top of the conversation, and you went into telling your story and all that you were had dealt with, and I so appreciated that vulnerability, because that burnout and all of that is real, and I truly experienced that at the height of the pandemic. It was those were some dark days. And so I just really appreciated you opening up your vulnerability, and creating that safe space is so important for men. But anyway, I can go on and on and on. But so
Absolutely.
so thank you.
Thank you for holding that space for me.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned something I watched on TV a little while ago that presented a good example, but that's very seldom you see someone present a good mental health example on TV. So that brings me to asking you about the influence of the media, the stereotypes and media portrayals of Black masculinity we see. How does that contribute to the harmful attitudes men have, not only just about their health, but about body image, their emotional wellness, overall health in our youth? And what kinds of stereotypes do you think are most damaging, and why?
Yeah. Oh man, this is a big one, because
it is. Sorry.
Because media often portrays Black men as hyper masculine. We either have to be athletes or criminals or thugs or hypersexual beings. Rarely are we portrayed or shown as, complex, as tender, as curious, like all of the other attributes that, our white counterparts are given the room and the space to be. We're not always given that space. So young boys grow up thinking that they need to toughen up, bulk up, and shut down emotionally in order to be seen as a man. And that can really mess with how they see their own worth, especially if they don't feel like they fit into that mold naturally.
Wow.
Yeah.
And just as a follow-up, what have you seen? How does that play out? In what ways does that play out, in terms of, you said they don't fit that mold naturally? What can you see play out in those instances?
Yeah, I mean, self-loathing. Because it's like they're not being authentic. So, it is a performance. That's why it's called performative masculinity.
Right, yeah.
You know, eventually when you perform long enough, you're gonna get tired. You're gonna get exhausted.
Yes.
You know, and then worse, you'll start actually believing the performance.
Wow.
You know, and if there's always this incongruency within, you know, within me, you know, I'll use me as an example. You know, if I'm a performer and there's this incongruence, there's something that always feels off, then I'm going to start making up stories and narratives about, you know, about my own worthiness.
Right.
Wow.
You know, or my enoughness, because, you know, as long as I keep performing and as long as I keep striving for this, you know, magical image or idea of perfection, that's not attainable. It's never going to be attainable. It's never going to be enough. So I'm always going to be on this hamster wheel of striving for enoughness and never getting there.
Right. That's sad. We are going to get to solutions for this, ladies and gentlemen. So hang with us, because we're just painting this bleak picture, because I was just thinking as you were saying that this is what leads. I mean, you're having to perform everywhere. So you are trying to prove your worthiness at home, at work, in your friend group. And then you meet a female, go out on a date, and the representatives, we always say, come to the first, second, third date, first 6 months to a year of the relationship before you even see the real person. And I heard a clinician even say recently, relationships are so dysfunctional because you have traumatic man trying to relate to traumatic woman, and neither is dealing with each other. They're actually just reacting from their past hurts. And that's what the picture you just painted.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, we often hear that, I guess, this narrative that women are more emotional than men. And I say that's absolutely incorrect.
Right.
You know, if anything, men are just as, if not more, emotional than women, but women are given the space and the room to be more emotionally expressive than men.
Exactly. And we need to fix the way we talk about that, because that's the way we should be saying it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know, and this came up quite a bit in my research, in that, you know, women, as difficult as it may be to, you know, for many women to admit, are complicit in performative masculinity, because they buy into the patriarchy. They believe the patriarchy.
Say more about that.
You know, well, just the gender norms. You know, women have a tendency to just fall right in line and have these narratives about, well, you know, my man can't cry because he's gonna, you know, I can't, he can't be a sissy, you know, that like that energy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, there are little ways in which we are complicit. We are.
Yeah.
Little ways. It might not be that particular way for everyone, but there is some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like
that's
I remember,
a whole other conversation, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm really being quiet right now because I don't want to go down that road.
I was planning to dig a little bit deeper in there, but I'm going to leave that alone.
Yeah, we have to get to some solutions.
I know.
well, I can share, like, you know, and I have an amazing relationship with my mother. But I remember as a kid, I was 6 years old. My mother put me in t-ball because she wanted me to learn. She wanted me to play sports. Right? I didn't. There was no real inquiry about whether or not I wanted to play sports. She just put me in t-ball. So I played t-ball for one season, and I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. So then, about a year later, she put me in karate. Again, I had expressed zero interest in karate, but I heard her tell someone one day, I'm putting him in karate because I want him to learn how to be aggressive. Now, as well-intentioned as that may have been, right? Because, you know, like that's what I'm talking about with the complicity. Because being aggressive just was not something that resonated with me.
Right.
You know? So I did karate for a couple of months, got up to like a 2nd degree yellow belt, and I was like, I'm done. I'm out.
Wow. Wow. Well, you talk about family. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about what role the school environment might play in either reinforcing or challenging unhealthy masculine norms for Black adolescent men. What are your thoughts about that? And I guess, are there any particular policies, teacher attitudes, or curricula that impact Black male adolescent males in this particular setting?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, school is complicit as well. Like a Black boy who's emotional or curious might be labeled as disruptive or disinterested.
Right.
Just because he's not performing how the system expects him to perform.
I've seen that.
Wow.
Yeah. And then teachers don't always make space for Black boys to learn in ways that engage their full selves,
Right.
mind and heart.
Wow.
And so the policies, there are policies in place that reward silence and compliance.
Right.
And
Be
and that
still,
punish.
quiet. Sit down.
Yeah.
Don't ask any
And
more
and it-
questions. It's not time yet.
Yeah. And these policies punish emotional expression. So Black boys are the most likely to be suspended for nonviolent behavior, especially when they challenge authority or show some type of emotion.
Wow.
Right. Wow.
But here's a real issue, though.
Okay.
Western education is not really about learning.
Okay.
It's about schooling children into performance and obedience.
Whoa.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard
Really?
that said. Yeah.
And then
By
and
my
then
pastor.
you're right.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
then so that happens at school, and then we get home and then have to perform and obey some more for our families. So we've been conditioned to be in survival mode from a very young age. And when are we given the room to breathe and to make mistakes? Or I call them mistakes. It's a mistake. If I do a mistake, I can do a retake. It's not the end of the
I like
world.
that. Yes.
I like that.
When are we given the room to fail forward without all of this added pressure to be a success all the time? They say pressure creates diamonds, but we're not made of stone.
Come on now.
Preach.
Wow. I
Wow.
like that. Yeah.
Well, that person dropping those gems right now, that's Dr. Frederick C. Sanders, our guest for this hour as we talk about performative masculinity and men's health. Very deep topic. We have about 10 minutes left to our broadcast. And I knew the hour would go by quick, so I definitely need to turn it towards solutions. I think people understand the issues
Yeah.
and what's causing the various things causing the issues. So let me ask this. What steps can communities and organizations take to redefine masculinity in a way that promotes healthier behaviors and emotional openness? And how important is it to, of course, involve young men themselves in shaping these initiatives?
Yeah. Awareness. Awareness. Be curious, not judgmental. We've got to be more inquisitive. We've got to be more inquisitive and start listening to our boys. Like let them tell us what being a man means to them, rather than us forcing some skewed narratives on them.
Yes. I like that.
Then let's co-create spaces in our schools and our churches and our barbershops where vulnerability is celebrated and not punished or ridiculed. Also, mentorship, life coaching, storytelling, like when we share our stories with each other, like what we talked about earlier, that all of that can go a long way in modeling new narratives of what manhood could look like. And the key is involving young men in shaping these ideas. We get to learn how they think rather than only teaching them what to think.
Wow.
Like teach them that they have agency to choose and to create who they desire to be in this world as a man.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So how do we make this shift from performativity into a healthier form of masculinity? Is there a way to navigate that? How do we navigate that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a lot of things, a lot of gender norms that get to be examined a bit more, and we get to, normalize other things like therapy.
Right.
Let's
start
there. Like, we get to normalize rest.
Mm-hmm.
So we can start with the fundamentals. Like there are, I have a background in what's called cognitive behavioral coaching. It borrows from cognitive behavioral therapy. And whenever I would work with clients, I very commonly got the response, why aren't we taught this in school? Why aren't we taught these, life skills? Sometimes in workspaces they're called soft skills. Like, they're not hard or soft, they're human skills.
Right. We hear this from our students as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. So I know we're running out of time. However, I really want to ask this question, Dr. Freddie. How did you really land on this topic? How did you become interested in this topic of performative masculinity? I know you've done a lot of research in this area.
Yeah, there were a couple of things. One, there was this video clip that I saw on social media several years ago. It was an interview that was done with Jane Fonda, and it was the end of the interview, and she was at some it was a women's event. It was like a women's conference. But they asked her at the end of this interview if there was something burning on her heart that she wanted to share, what would that be? And I'll never forget what she said, and I can't repeat it all verbatim, but the gist of it was, she was like, I know we're here to celebrate and talk about women, but I have to put in a plug for our boys because our boys are in trouble. They're not safe. They're called, there's this issue of bifurcation, this disconnection head to heart. And they're not safe. They're called sissies and pansies and mama's boys, and they don't know how to process their emotions, and so they start acting out with sex and booze and drugs and all these other things. And so she was like, I just really want to put in a plug that we get to do everything we can to make our boys safe enough to explore the full spectrum of their manhood.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So that was one thing. And then there was this other, there was a film that I watched that I was introduced to called The Mask You Live In.
From the very beginning, I was thinking about that film.
Okay.
Excellent one to watch.
Beautiful.
I think I've sent you that. I've sent you that link before, Dr. Hart, among many.
Okay.
I'm always sending Dr. Hart a link, but this was one of the first ones I think I remembered wanting to send him. Yeah.
So what was it about that, Dr. Freddie, that piece?
I just thought, so it was created by Jennifer Siebel Newsom, who is, I believe, still the
Gavin Newsom, first lady
Gavin
of
Newsom.
California.
Yeah, Gavin Newsom's wife. She and her team did a beautiful job and a very comprehensive job of exploring, again, the full spectrum of masculinity and sort of breaking down. They never used the term performative masculinity, but they did a great job of sort of unpacking a lot of what we discussed today. Not so much from the specific lens of blackness or black boys, but just really using data and science to sort of break down what some of the issues around masculinity are, and ways that that we can address some of these very common issues that males face.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we are definitely coming to the last few minutes of the show. So you want to leave us with any closing thoughts? First of all, any resources? How can we know we need to help a young man who may be dealing with some unhealthy performative behaviors? Any last words? Yeah.
Yeah. Masculinity is not monolithic. Men are not monoliths. Masculinity is not a one size fits all. We all get to define, as men, we get to define it for ourselves. We get to define our own masculinity. So as far as tools and resources, I would definitely say check out pretty much anything that Bell Hooks has written.
Bell Hooks.
Bell Hooks.
Okay.
Yeah. She unfortunately is no longer with us, but I would not have a doctoral dissertation without Bell Hooks and her brilliant, masterful work. Specifically, a book called The Will to Change is all about masculinity. And then, of course, the film I mentioned earlier, The Mask You Live In. It's on
YouTube.
I think it's on YouTube still.
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe it's still on YouTube. And then, if after you do some of that work on your own, if you're ready to go deeper, then, check me out. Reach out to me. Go to my website, fcsanders.com. Reach out to me. And if it's not me, consider hiring a life coach. Not to fix you, because you're not broken.
There you go.
But to help you remember who you are and who you were before the mask. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. You don't have to do this life by yourself. Let's do it together, because that's how we reclaim our freedom. Unmitigated, uninterrupted freedom.
Wow.
Mic drop.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Dr. Freddie, for being on the show today and for everything that you've left us to really think about, really, really sit with and think about. And I'm sure we'll have you back at some point, because this discussion needs to happen more often.
My honor and my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right.